Hey folks, I'm excited to announce the release of Bushel 2. Bushel 2 introduces the new screenshot and screen recording feature. This allows you to record your VM and add titles, notes, and export to anywhere you want. So please give Bushel 2 a try if you haven't already. I'm excited to keep working on Bushel and looking forward to adding new features in 2025. There's still a sale for Bushel Pro for first-time users. It's 50% off. So definitely take advantage of that. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to another episode of Empower Apps. I'm your host, Leo Dion. Today, I'm joined with Donny Wals. Donny, thank you so much for coming on again.
Yeah. Hey, yeah, great to be on again. Thanks for inviting me. Always love catching up, love chatting. So, yeah.
For people who don't practically know who you are, yeah, thank you. I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure, yeah. So my name is Donny Wals. I've been making apps, websites, server-side things for probably about 18 years now. Was 10 of them on the iOS platform, mostly, pretty much since Swift came out, a little bit before that. And a couple of years ago, I decided that I was going to write some books to help people learn some of the more interesting to me topics in the realm of building apps. So that would be core data, combine, concurrency. And yeah, you might have seen me around on social media, on my blog, on my books, YouTube, those kinds of places.
Of course, we'll have links to all that stuff in the show notes.
Yes, thank you.
So we were talking before the show. You didn't put out any books this year.
No.
Why is that? And maybe what are you thinking about writing about next?
Yeah, so last year, Apple had Swift concurrency sort of more, how would you say that? Like not necessarily finished, but it was getting close to finished. It felt like it wasn't moving as much. I was very wrong on that, but we'll talk about that more, I assume. So I decided last year I'm going to do a book on concurrency, and Apple also launched Swift Data. So for a moment, I thought maybe I need to be working on 2 books this year. So I immediately went ahead and started planning out a Swift Data book. But there was still so much missing from Swift Data last year that I decided it's not worth me writing about right now. I already have concurrency, which is a hot topic. So maybe I'll do Swift Data this year. So I kind of saved myself for that. And then this year, Apple didn't really change that much in Swift Data. And so I'm still kind of waiting for that to be more baked. And then there's Swift testing, which is a topic that I am interested in. But I just didn't have that much time to actually dig into that because, I can only focus on so many things.
Right.
So those are also the 2 that I would be thinking about, testing and Swift Data.
So let's first start with Swift Data. What's missing?
Oh, okay. So definitely it doesn't have support for sharing records, right? It has a public database, I believe, and that's it. Whereas with core data, you can have public, private, and shared records. So that's already a huge difference. There's pretty much no tooling to properly use Swift Data outside of Swift UI views, whereas with core data, you can use some of Swift UI built-in property wrappers, but you're also free to do a lot more customization. There's still bugs when you insert stuff from a background context where the main context doesn't automatically update unless you perform some workarounds or not even when you save it. You have to listen for a notification from core data and then manually trigger a redraw on your view.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things, there's still a lot of rough edges like that. And I just feel like Apple didn't get around to addressing them this year. And with what they did do, right, because now we can have custom underlying stores. They showed that, where you can write your own. I'm honestly not even sure if next year they'll have core data as a default anymore. Because you would think that they would have been able to bridge more and more functionality from core data into Swift Data. That doesn't seem too hard. He said, right, sort of not knowing what goes into it. But I mean, like the functionality is there. So I felt like maybe this year they'll bridge more of that, but they didn't bridge anything additionally. Instead, they made it so that you can swap stores. So maybe they're moving away from core data. I don't know.
I mean, do you think, and we'll talk about combine later, do you think Daniel had made this point in I think it was the Swift Deep Dish talk that he gave this year about combine and Swift data. Do you think, like, are we ever going to have a combined situation with Swift data where they're just like, yeah, just keep doing core data?
Hmm. Yeah, I'm not too sure about that. It
Okay,
is most certainly looking like it, right? Because Combine came out and we're just like, oh, there's just a couple pieces missing for it to be as powerful as RX. They're almost there, so surely next year they'll do it. And then they kind of said, we're done with Combine. We think it does what it needs to do. We'll do a couple quality of life improvements, and that's about it.
hmm,
I think Swift Data, what they're doing, I think they wanted to do a lot more than they actually got to ship. Because they shipped so little, like from the outside point of view, where it's like, okay, so we can make our own stores. Why would we want to do that? Swift Data itself doesn't even seem completely finished yet.
right,
And so it felt like maybe they were trying to do something much bigger. And this is the one part that they could ship this year, and then next year in June, we're going to maybe see something huge. So I think it might not be like Combined because it really feels like they set themselves up to do something much bigger with Swift Data. But
right.
we'll have to see at DubDub. I think if at this DubDub they don't do much or they do something similar, then maybe it is going to be more like Combined.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a great point. I think if they don't do it this year, last year was so. We'll talk about AI later. It was so emphasis on AI. There
Mm-hmm.
wasn't much of anything this year. But like, yeah, if they don't do anything with Swift UI, then or Swift Data, then yeah, I could see how what the heck is going on, guys. Um, so yeah, the issues I've run into with Swift Data, so I've done a lot of Swift Data with Bushel. Hopefully by the time this episode is out, Bushel 2 will be out, and I open sourced a lot of the like kind of agnostic code into a library called Data Thespian. Thank you very much, because it has to do with actors and data. So,
Very nice.
yeah, thank you. So, yeah, the issues I ran into were like the whole temporary ID. Like, if you start doing stuff with things that are temporary and not yet saved, it crashes. And
Mm-hmm.
then dealing with contexts and Switch UI, like the auto save is not that great. Like, I moved over to auto saved and I was just surprised at how little it
Yeah.
saves. So there's a lot of points in Bushel where I just end up having to save manually, and then yeah, I ended up doing a lot of stuff with using that core data notification to let things know that things have been updated.
Yeah.
Because yeah, as far as like Swift UI is concerned, you're pretty much like you end up having to do a lot of manual stuff. Like queries are great, but like it's it's very incomplete with what you actually need for SwiftUI
Yeah.
and Swift Data.
Yeah, it's great you mentioned context because I think probably my biggest thing that I'm missing is child context. Like I use them all the time. I'll make a child managed object context. I'll load an object into it, pass it to a view, allow the view to edit it. If I don't want the changes, I just throw the context away. If I do want the changes, I save it into the main context. That just doesn't exist in Swift data. So you're stuck copying every property from an object into a state var so that you can then manipulate the state var. And when you save it, you copy everything back. It's way more involved.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Um, Anything else you want to talk about Swift Data? So you think, would you write a book? I guess, are you thinking I'll write a book if StubDub says a lot of stuff, but otherwise, uh,
Probably, yeah, yeah. It's
okay,
because it's. I have the core data book, and I feel like that's still the much better option. So it would feel weird to write a book about the other technology, where basically almost every chapter is going to end with, "But if you want everything, you should check out core data."
yeah.
I kind of don't want that, so I'm not sure yet. It really depends on what happens at DubDub, whether I would feel that that's a feasible book to be working on.
Would you even like write a chapter maybe for Swift Data in your core data book?
I've considered that. Core data is up for an update, so it's something that's still in the back of my mind. Like maybe I should just, write about that. But then it would mostly be about like interoperability. Like when you hit something that's not there in Swift data or where it doesn't work, how do you build a bridge between the
Yeah.
two? Because you can do it, whether it's pretty or not. I'll leave that up to the eyes of the beholder, I guess.
Yeah, if you want some really good content on Swift data and core data, I recommend Fat Bob Man.
Yeah.
He's got some really great blog posts. I'll link in the show notes, but definitely check his stuff out. So the other thing you mentioned was Swift testing, and we had a really great episode on Swift testing with Daniel a few episodes ago. And what was your favorite thing about Swift testing over XC testing?
Oh, I think, just the overall syntax of it, right? When I look at it, the fact that I can just write add test func and then write anything, basically like in any file in a test target, is already so useful. Like it makes it super quick, super easy to just throw in a bunch of tests. And yeah, I've been thinking about this the other day actually, like why am I so much more eager to write tests with Swift testing than I ever was with XC test? And I'm just not entirely sure. I think it's the whole package.
Do you think so? We just talked about Swift data. Swift testing, is there anything missing from XC testing that you are like really desperate for outside of UI testing, which is a whole other thing?
Yeah. So UI testing, I don't do much of that anyway. So that I'm okay with that. I do feel like Apple sort of dropped the ball on giving us a good way to test our completion handler based code.
Okay.
Test methods in Swift testing are async, and they work really well with your async await code. But then if you want to test something that uses a completion handler, Apple recommends that we use something called a confirmation, which gives us a closure, and we can call that confirmation any amount of times that we specify we should. So if we have, something that does a piece of work in 10 steps, we can say this confirmation is going to be called 10 times.
Right.
The issue is that you call that function and you give it a closure, and then that closure runs, and it's an async closure, so you can await things in there. And then when the closure returns, you're expected to have called all of your confirmations. So in practice, that means if you call an old school completion handler based API, then your confirmation closure is returning before your completion handler got called. So you need to have something to await inside of that thing. And it's like, so I already have this async await code. Why am I using this confirmation thing then? Like it has its uses. But what I would want to do is just test my old code with it. And I can only do that when I use a continuation.
Right.
So there is a tool for that. It's a Swift concurrency tool. But it really feels like Swift testing should have had something for that, similar to test expectations in XC test.
Right. Do you like one of the missing pieces that I saw was like a lack of one of the problems with Swift is you can't go in and like swizzle stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's specifically a static type language, and we have macros, but then like I was expecting maybe like a macro to be able to create mocks easily and things like that, stubs and so on. And that I feel like is something I'd really want, is like just an easy way to like, okay, it's a protocol, just implement everything, and then here's a few implementations. And the macro would just handle it for me, and then that way I can easily test that kind of stuff. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, that would be. I would love to have that, and yeah, somebody could write that, but we all know macros are a pain in the butt. So,
for sure.
Yeah.
Do you do any? Cool.
Have you written any macros or anything?
I have not. No, I looked very briefly at how to do it, but I've never really felt the need to write one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like places where I could have maybe used a macro, but they're so few and far in between where it's like all the hassle of making a macro probably wasn't worth it. And I'm also
Right.
always a little bit cautious with those things because I don't want to end up going overboard with it. Like once you sort of start using them, maybe you go overboard and you almost end up with this version of Swift that's only recognizable to you. I know that's sort of a
No,
stretch of
totally.
like what macros can do. I think C or whatever C sharp, one of them, people go overboard with that, where you can basically have a completely new dialect of C just because of the macros. Um, yeah, I think that's like pulling it, like stretching it really far. But yeah, I think the macros that we get from Apple are good. I don't feel too inclined to be writing my own
Yeah,
just yet.
100%. I wrote one for option sets recently, and I was like, yeah, that's good. And then I tried something else that was more difficult. I'm like, yeah,
Mm.
I'm not pulling up a syntax tree or anything like that. Like, not
Yeah,
something I'm interested in deep diving into because it's like a rabbit hole, right? Once you do it, it's like, yeah,
yeah. There's like a whole bunch of things that you have to know and understand before you can properly make your own.
right, right. Um, okay, well, you mentioned concurrency, so let's talk about concurrency. Uh, yeah. So, what do you think is the most challenging part about concurrency?
Oh, I think for me, the hardest part is when you have an existing project and you're trying to understand all the bits and pieces. So you're basically learning this on top of your existing skill set, and you're taking in every proposal, every piece by piece. There's so much changing, and the proposals aren't always written in the most easy to follow language. Like it's very academic, very compiler engineer oriented, not necessarily end user oriented. And as a result, I feel like you start tripping up over details and over complexities that somebody that's coming into it fresh, maybe even in a new project, like won't be bothered by too much. I think that's the hardest part is um, sort of taking your existing code, your existing knowledge, and then putting concurrency into it. I think that sort of creates this mix of overlaps and differences that's really hard to follow for people.
Right, right. Yeah, and it's not as intuitive for a lot of Swift developers, especially when you get into actors.
Yeah.
And like, okay, main actor, where does that go? Well, a lot of us have pre knowledge already, right, of dispatch groups and,
Mm-hmm.
and GCD, right? So we come into it with this preset of knowledge, and then we try applying those same rules to concurrency, and it's just not. It doesn't match up quite right. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah.
Um, what what do you think is the biggest revelation you've had when you've written blog posts or books about the new stuff with concurrency?
Huh. That's a really good one. Um, I think it happened a while back where, and it's also the part that Apple is probably going to change, but that it's super easy to have work that's not on the main thread right now. If you write a function, make it async, you make sure it's not like somehow isolated to an actor or to the main actor specifically, you know that that's always going to run in the background. I think in Swift 5.5 or whenever they first introduced concurrency, that wasn't
Right.
always the case.
Okay.
But then they formalized the behavior and he said every non isolated async function is going to run on the global executor. So that means it's on the main thread. And that completely eliminates the need to have detached tasks. Right? So that on top of the fact that an await from the main actor doesn't block the main actor, I think those two things, for me, when I first started learning, were very eye-opening and very important details of how concurrency works.
What's the ramifications for that? As far as like having everything run on the global thread or the global actor, I
Yeah.
should say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, global executor even.
Global
Um,
executor.
yeah, yeah. So that's basically like the thread pool that contains everything except for main.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So the biggest ramification is probably that a lot of your code is going to be considered concurrent, even when you don't want it to, right? So let's say you have a view model with an async function, and you have your main actor annotated SwiftUI view, which all views since iOS 18 are by default.
Right.
What happens is you're now calling from the main actor to a non-isolated async context. So you're immediately going to the background. And that will have you run into issues where the compiler is going to tell you in Swift 6 mode that you're bridging your view model instance, which is tied to the main actor, into a non-isolated async function.
Yep.
So problems start to happen immediately where you're just like, okay, what do I do here? And then what happens is a lot of people just start slapping main actor on everything because that gets the warning to go away. And then in theory, you could argue that's fine, right? Because you are normally interacting from the main thread with that view model. So calling functions on that view model would have the functions run on main anyway. Right? In most code bases, I would say you go from the view to the view model, from the view model to your data layer, from your data layer to the network. And it isn't until URL session starts to make the call that you leave your main thread. I think very few people explicitly leave the main thread in their view model or their data layer.
Mm-hmm.
But now you're applying the main actor annotation to all these things, and you feel like, oh no, I'm definitely blocking the main thread right now. So that becomes scary. And yeah, so that is a problem, both in adoption, in fixing it, because a lot of people are now dealing with sendable issues where they technically don't even need something to be sendable because they just want to send it from the main actor all the way to the network.
Right.
And that's it. They don't even want to use certain models in the background.
Yeah. So like
all
my view models are basically main actor.
Yeah.
And then like what I ended up doing is either A, making an actor so that way it like runs on its own space.
Mm-hmm.
Because you'll have stuff where you can read and write at the same time. That's essentially the issue, right?
Exactly.
The other thing that's really thrown me a curveball is the stuff with like, so they added a bunch of prefixes to parameter arguments, like kind of similar to the non-copyable stuff, but like where you have to say this consumes it or this doesn't consume it, and that's where I've run into issues lately. Is the ambiguity about that. Even when you mark something as sendable, you have to still be careful about that, I've found. You know what I'm talking about?
I think I do, yeah.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of rough edges around that. And they're trying to solve some of this with more keywords, like the sending keyword.
Right.
Right, where they're basically allowing you to say, okay, so if I pass a non-sendable thing into this function, that's fine. But after it's been passed to this function, the caller can't use that object again, right? That's sort of how you can pass stuff from one isolation boundary to the next and tell the compiler, I know what I'm doing, I intend to do this, just warn me if I'm using this object again after sending it to some other place.
Do you think
is a whole
gonna make
other
it more
rabbit hole.
challenging?
I think what they did with it is really useful, and I think it also solved a lot of errors for a lot of people. Like when you task currently has a sending closure instead of a sendable closure, and that makes it so that you can safely use certain non-sendable things inside of your task, as long as you don't also use them in other tasks or after you've made your task. So I think for a lot of people that solves an issue. I think the underlying problem that a lot of people still run into is the fact that non-isolated async functions don't inherit the caller's isolation, which means if you have your main actor view, your non-main actor view model, you're leaving the main actor immediately.
Right.
And that's a problem that Apple wants to solve now. Like they've been publishing some proposals and manifests around this in the past few weeks, where they basically say, okay, maybe we should change how that model works. And yeah, almost revert, not entirely, but almost revert that thing they changed around Swift 5.6 or right after 5.5 or whatever it was, where non-isolated async functions will inherit the isolation context of their caller, which means, right, if you have your main actor annotated view, your non-main actor annotated view model, that an async function on your view model will still run on main if it was called from main. Basically getting you back into your old GCD-like behavior.
Do you think, I mean, do you like that? Do you think that there's performance issues with doing that?
I think performance issues, we won't get that so much. I think that's not a concern. The thing I'm most concerned about is we've had 3.5 years now with the current model. And before Apple's going to introduce this change, we'll probably have had 4 or so years. I doubt they'll do it just randomly. So I think maybe dub is a good moment where we have a beta period. Um, but yeah, we'll have had a whole bunch of times with the current model. And a lot of people aren't explicitly aware of how this model works.
No,
So I
they're not.
think so I think for a lot of people, code just kind of works the way it does. Apple's going to make this change, and people are probably not even going to really notice. Um, but for those that do know the behavior and do have like their expectations around it, it's going to be really important that Apple has a good migration path, which I'm sure they can do because they can detect non-isolated async. So if there's like some annotation that we have to add, they can automate that. The part that's most worrying to me is that we have a backlog of, by then, probably 4 or more years of content that's out there online telling people how this thing works, but then they've changed it in some Swift version. And so a lot of people are going to have to go back to update their blog posts, re-record YouTube videos, add annotations here and there to make sure that people don't come to expect something.
Teach their AI model the correct way to do it.
Yeah, so AI for Swift's already a big mess, right? Because every dot release changes things.
Yeah.
But this is definitely going to hurt, people's ability to Google or use LLMs to learn about concurrency.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of that. But I mean, there's a lot of stuff online where it's like, oh, we changed it in this. So yeah, I could see that that's a problem, but eventually it'll get fixed.
I think long term it's probably the right thing to do.
Yeah.
I think short term it's a little sad that we've had 4 years with this model and only now Apple's deciding that this is not the way they want it to go.
So if they go with the old way, can you mark a method as it should not run in the main actor?
So if they revert, it's not technically reverting, but if they revert the current model,
yeah,
you mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what they're wanting to do is introduce either another keyword, an annotation, or something like that, where you can say, it's going to turn into something like a detached func my name async throws or whatever, or non-isolated func or something like that, where we have to get explicit in terms of what we want, as in we don't want this to inherit isolation context. I think if Apple adds that, it'll be fine long term, but it's definitely going to make our functions messier.
Right. Let's see what else. So let's talk about it. Do you think combine is dead?
Oh, okay. That's an interesting one. I don't. I really don't. And I think probably me and like 20 other people in the world to this day will say I don't think it's dead. I've tried to not use combine in projects. And the problems really arise when you try and observe state. So if you have an observable object with published properties and you want to observe those published properties for changes, doing that with async streams, it's possible, but it's more tedious if you want to have the full feature set of what publishers can do. You have to use Swift algorithms, and even then you don't get the full feature set because you can't have two iterators on the same async stream at the exact same time. So there's still like a couple things missing there for state observation, right? So I want to be very specific on that, state observation. For everything else, I think combine was always not the best tool, right? So if you had your networking layer that would give you a publisher and the publisher would give you the result in the network call, that worked, right? It was a fine model, and it fit this functional reactive way of thinking that some people really subscribe to. But I think for like most folks, that never was the most elegant way to do networking or to do async processes. So for the parts where you use async or combine as an async programming library, for those parts of it, combine's definitely dead. But it should have never been fully alive to begin with, I think.
Do you, when you say state observation, though, you're assuming it's an observed object. What if it's just using observable?
Right. So that observing properties on an observable is a pain either way. Like I don't like the syntax we have
Okay.
for doing it right now. I actually dug into why it is the way it is, right? Because you have to write that with observation tracking closure, access the properties that you're interested in, and then whenever you get an update, you have to resubscribe or something like that.
Yeah.
It's almost like the very old WebSocket APIs that Apple had. And the whole reason it is like that is Apple made this. They actually had somebody say this on the forums. They made this so that SwiftUI could have it, and then they kind of stopped working on it, and that's 2 years ago. And they did express interest, or at least the person that worked on the proposals expressed interest in making it more general purpose, but they just never got around to it. I don't think Apple has a ton of interest in making observable convenient outside of SwiftUI at this point. It's usable,
So, like,
you can do it, but
what I've ended up doing, so everything in Bushel is observable, and I just end up using will set to monitor changes and make changes within the object itself.
yeah, so that's
And
within
doing
the object, right? But what if
right.
you have another object that wants to observe a property from your observable?
Yeah, how do I do that? That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, there's always a way, passing in a method, or
Sure,
yeah,
yeah.
that's what
But
I've ended up doing.
yeah,
Where
it's just not as convenient as published.
Oh,
I
100%,
think,
yeah. So where I've ended up using Combine a lot is with the built-in publishers that exist. Like we had talked about previously with Swift Data. Like I'm using Combine to observe notifications about changes to the data, right?
Yeah,
That works out really well. Or if you do anything, well, that's Notification Center, right? So if you do anything with those built-in ones, what was the other one? There's 3, right? URL session has a publisher, Notification Center has a publisher, and there's one more I'm missing. But timer, that's what it is. The timer. Yep, those are the ones where I end up using Combine. Mostly.
and I think it's still the right tool for the job in those places.
Right.
I've tried like going all in on async sequences, like async for loops. It's just too easy to create memory leaks.
Right.
If you make your own async streams, you can't have more than one for loop on it. You don't often need it, but when you do, it's nice that it's possible to have like multicasting. So yeah, I don't think Combine's dead yet. I think Combine is just sort of sitting there, having its one or two purposes in the world, and that's kind of where it sits.
Do you think there's a place for any of the functional programming stuff, or do you feel like async sequence kind of, or async algorithms kind of fills that void if you want to go that route, or like?
I think for the most part it does. I think it's not fully there yet. I couldn't give you great examples from the top of my head other than multicasting, but I think it's not fully there yet. But at least the nice thing with Swift algorithms is it's open source. It is Apple managed, but the nice thing with these packages is that they can be updated without needing a Swift update, without needing an iOS update. So anything that's in these packages is essentially by definition something that you can just pull in right now and use on any project, and you'll have backwards compatibility for years.
Well, Donny, it was really good to talk to you. We'll talk more about some of the other stuff like the Vision Pro and AI and all that in the next half of the episode. Before we close out, where can people find you online?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me, and I look forward to continuing that conversation. People can find me on X, Threads, Mastodon, Blue Sky, right? Pretty much every social network, YouTube, I'm also on there. But if you really want to have a conversation with me or hang out or just sort of, be where I'm most active, come find me at Blue Sky, because that's where currently I think everybody is at. And so I just follow the flock.
Awesome. People can find me on Twitter at LeoGDion. My company is Bright Jidget. I'm also on Mastodon, Blue Sky, Threads, Leo GD if you're listening to this on a podcast, please give me a review. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. It's good to see everybody. Talk to you later. Bye.
See ya.